Lindsay Littleson is an award-winning writer of children's books. She left her job as a primary school teacher to concentrate on her writing and now has several books under her belt. Lindsay tells us about the research for the Titanic Detective Agency that led her to discover 12-year-old Bertha Watt from Aberdeen, who became a lead character in the novel. Lindsay also discovered a real-life crime was committed aboard the doomed ship, which became part of the plot of the book. Find out more about Lindsay's books at www.lindsaylittleson.co.uk.
My name is Lindsay Littleson and I'm the author of 5 novels for children, including Guardians of the Wild Unicorns and the Titanic Detective Agency. When my publisher suggested that I should write a book set on Titanic, my first thoughts were, oh my goodness, that sounds really exciting. But then she said that she'd like it to have a Scottish twist. And for a while I wasn't sure how I was going to achieve that. The only Scottish accent I could remember from the Titanic movie was William Murdoch's. William Murdoch was the first officer on Titanic. He was 39 years old. He wasn't really a suitable protagonist for a children's book. But then I started to do some research and I got really drawn into the whole story and I thought, I really want to do this. I really, really do. So I had a really good look at the passenger list and I found the perfect passenger on board. This was this girl up here, Bertha Watt. Bertha Watt was 12 years old and she was from Aberdeen. She was travelling on board the ship with her mother, and those 3 facts made her the perfect passenger for my story because she was Scottish, so she gave me my Scottish twist. She was the right age, and also the fact that her father wasn't on board was very important. Most of the men in second class on Titanic died that night, and I didn't want my story to end with a terrible personal tragedy for my main character. So luckily, Bertha's dad was already safely in Oregon. He was already there. And also, another reason that Bertha was the perfect passenger was she wrote about it later. In her class newsletter, she wrote the story of what happened to her that night. So I could tell the story of the sinking almost in her own words, which was fantastic. And also, because she was a real-life character, she had descendants. I was able to speak to her granddaughter, Nancy, and Nancy was able to tell me some facts about her granny's experience on Titanic, facts that I was able to include in the novel. Of course, there were more than 2,000 people on board the ship, and I wanted to tell the story from the perspective of a third-class passenger too. So I needed another main character, and I found one, this lad on the passenger list, Johan Servan Svensson. He was a Swedish lad and he was travelling on his own, 14 years old, to work on his father's farm in South Dakota. It wasn't hard to imagine his fear and his worry. He spoke no English. He was leaving his mother and all his younger siblings to work a hard life as a labourer on a farm. How was he going to cope when the ship started to sink? We know that boys his age in third class were treated as grown men on the night of the disaster. And Johan couldn't speak any English. So when the officers were shouting, "Women and children first," he didn't know why they weren't letting him save his own life. So he became my other passenger. But what I was in dire need of was an exciting plot. And I found one. Because newspaper reports at the time gave me the necessary scoop. One of the passengers, this one up here, wasn't who he claimed to be. My twist on this historical fact was to turn Bertha Watt into a detective, one who's determined to solve the mystery of the mysterious widower, Mr. Lewis Hoffman. Convinced that Mr. Hoffman's up to no good, Bertha sets up the Titanic Detective Agency with the help of her new friend, Marjorie Collier, known as Madge. When Johann asks for their help in deciphering a map he's discovered, Bertha adds the strange boy in the treasure map to her casebook. Bertha and Madge work on solving the mysteries, both of them unaware that the ship is steaming towards disaster and that time is running out for hundreds of those on board. When I was researching the characters' life stories, I had to consider carefully what details to include, as there's no getting round the fact that the Titanic was a desperately tragic event, but it was important for me not to make the ending too sad for young readers. Obviously, I can't read the ending now, as that would spoil the story, but I'm going to finish with a short extract from the beginning of the end for the ship. So this is when Titanic has started to sink. Some of the crew have realised that there is a trouble on board, and the first and second passengers are being asked to put on their life jackets. As they lumbered out the cabin, awkward in the heavy life jackets, Bertha's stomach lurched. She was reluctant to voice the questions preying on her mind. If the ship has really hit an iceberg, if the crew are already lowering the lifeboats filled with first-class passengers, why did the steward tell Mum to go back to bed? Is it because there isn't enough room in the lifeboats for everyone? Fear prickled her insides as she thought of the stokers deep down in the engine room, of Reg trapped at his post, of Johann in his third-class cabin on E-deck. She hoped they all had a Mr. Collier to tell them what was going on and were heading up to the lifeboats. She prayed they were not being told by the stewards, "There's nothing the matter, you should go back to bed," because there was something terribly wrong. She could feel it. For the first time she'd become aware that the steady thrum of the engines had stopped, and the absence of sound was chilling. But there were other noises, a clattering of feet in the stairway, a rumble of raised voices outside in the passageway. Her mother ushered her along the corridor and up the stairs. As she climbed, Bertha had the strangest feeling that the ship was slightly off kilter and that they were tipping forward as they climbed. Fear made her hands clammy, her mouth dry. When she walked outside onto the boat deck, the shock of the cold made her gasp. She could hardly hear what people were saying because of the noise, a harsh, deafening screech. "What's that dreadful noise?" she asked, huddling against the warm tweed of her mother's coat. "I asked Mr. Collier the same thing. He said it's high-pressure steam venting from the boilers, just like in a locomotive. It's nothing to worry about." "What's happening?" asked Ellen Toomey, staring around, eyes frantic. "What are our instructions?" "We need to wait, Ellen." Mother's tone was crisp. "And we need to stay calm. Panicking will help nobody. Take deep, calming breaths. Imagine we're picnicking in a wheat field." Ellen looked at Bertha's mother as if she were crazy, but Bertha felt a little comforted. There wasn't a trace of fear in her mother's voice. If her mother could be this brave, so could she. She looked around, trying to make sense of the scene on deck. There didn't seem to be any panic, but people were milling around, clearly unsure what to do. The boat deck was cluttered with abandoned bags and cases, which made crossing it an obstacle course. Families huddled, mothers clutching children, young couples clinging to one another. Some were weeping, others looked thoroughly annoyed to have been disturbed from their sleep. The vast majority appeared to be first or second class passengers, and few of them were properly dressed for the weather. Some of the ladies were shivering in silk evening gowns, and many, like Bertha, were wearing coats over nightclothes and slippers. "They refused to let me collect my jewellery case from the purser's office," she heard a lady complain. "It's a disgrace. I shall complain to the White Star Line in the strongest possible terms when we reach New York." For what seemed like an hour, but might only have been a few minutes, Bertha and the three women stood, frozen, with no idea where to go or what to do, waiting for instructions that didn't come. She saw the colliers and shouted for Madge, who didn't hear her. And no wonder, because the orchestra had set up on deck and had begun to play jaunty tunes, which fought to be heard over the frantic screeching from the ship's boilers. "Lower away!" an officer shouted. The deckhands got to work, and another lifeboat, less than half full, was lowered over the port side of the ship. Mother held Bertha close and looked right and left, trying to weigh up the options. "There's Officer Murdoch. He's a Scot. He'll know what's going on. Come this way." Stumbling in her slippers, the icy air slicing at her bare legs, Bertha hurried across the deck, the other ladies following, towards the starboard side. When a projectile whizzed into the air, followed by a deafening bang, Bertha ducked, afraid Titanic was breaking apart. When she looked up, a great shower of stars was cascading from the sky. She screwed up her face, baffled. Why are they setting off fireworks now? Her mother gave her hand a squeeze. "The captain's firing distress rockets in the hope that another ship will see us and come immediately to our rescue. There are bound to be several in the vicinity." She sounded completely convincing, but Bertha couldn't help wondering if her mother's unruffled exterior was for her benefit. Was panic bubbling up in her mother's chest, the way it was in her own? So that was the beginning of the end for the Titanic, and I hope you enjoyed the story. Thank you very much for listening.